Hello, friends. You're listening to the Outside the Walls podcast. I'm Chris Dirksen. Today, Chris Lowen and I are talking with Sheila Gregoire, a committed Christian and researcher who has interviewed more than 30,000 Christian men and women on the topics of sex and marriage. Through her extensive research and interviews, she has uncovered a number of harmful myths that many Christians believe about these subjects. Some of the topics we're going to cover in today's conversation include: what is purity culture? How single people have been impacted by bad Christian teaching about marriage. How to talk to kids about sex and not just abstinence. Chastity versus virginity, the roots of porn use, and many more. Sheila is an absolute goldmine of practical wisdom and insight into marriage, singleness, and sex. Now, since we're talking about sex, if you have kids around, you may want to listen to this without them. I don't know, that's up to you. I hope you find this conversation as helpful, enlightening, and encouraging as we did.
Hey, Sheila, welcome to our Outside the World podcast. How are you?
I am doing great. Good to talk to you.
Awesome. So, Sheila, tell us a bit about who you are, where you're from, and some of the books that you've written and what you do.
Oh, gosh. Okay. So I live in southeastern Ontario with my husband. We have 2 adult daughters, 2 grandkids, 1 grandkid who will be here maybe by the time this airs. I don't know. So
Oh, wow.
pretty exciting. Yep. And I've been blogging about sex and marriage in the evangelical world since like 2008. I started out as a mommy blogger, parenting, housework, all of that fun stuff. And the more I talked about sex, the more my traffic grew. So I kind of became this evangelical sex person, which is weird. But that's where I was. And then everything kind of changed for me in 2000 when I had a migraine one day. And so I was trying to procrastinate, and I was on Twitter, and people were debating whether they needed love or respect. And they were referring to one of the best-selling evangelical books, Love and Respect. And I thought, I have that in my shelf. It's a great way to procrastinate. So I went and got it, and I read it. And it was like a nuclear bomb went off in my living room, because I had just never realized what other books were saying. I didn't want to read anything in case I plagiarized. And I thought, I love Jesus, they love Jesus, we're all saying the same thing. And on that day, I realized that we weren't. And so that changed the focus of everything we do. And since then, we've become researchers, and we've been trying to measure how messages so common in the evangelical world are actually hurting our marriages and calling the church to more.
Wow. Okay. Like let's just jump straight into that. So you did a survey in 2019 called the Bear Marriage Survey, like I think 20,000 women.
Yep.
Tell us, okay, your inspiration, how you did that, some of the big things you learned from that. Tell us the story of the Bear Marriage Survey.
Well, once we read Love and Respect, we did a whole week on it on our blog, and we were inundated with hundreds of women saying how that book enabled abuse in their marriage. And so I wrote a report. I sent it to Focus on the Family. I knew Jim Daly. I'd been on the show 3 times. I thought he would listen, and they didn't. And so my team and I were talking, and we were like, if they're not going to listen to hundreds of women, maybe they'll listen to 20,000. And so we made it our goal that we were going to survey 20,000 women, and just see. And actually see, like, we're gonna lay it all out there. We're gonna say, okay, here's a bunch of messages, and have you ever believed them? Have you ever been taught them? And then we also asked women to rate their marital and sexual satisfaction, and we were able to see how messages affected women and which ones hurt them. And it was really sobering.
So what were some of the, like, let's just jump right into some of the details there. What were some of the specific negative finds that you found out?
Well, there were four big messages that we talk about in our first big book, The Great Sex Rescue. So there's 4 big messages that we look at, which were really harmful. But, in the words of Lord of the Rings, there's kind of, one ring that rules them all, one ring to bind them kind of thing. And so there's one teaching that's kind of over all of them. And it's summed up by this one line in Love and Respect, when Emerson Eggerichs says, to women, if your husband is typical, he has a need that you don't have. So it's this idea that sex is for men, not for women.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And he goes on to say that sex is about a husband's physical release, and he needs physical release like you need emotional release. There wasn't a single word in that chapter about how women should feel pleasure too. Nothing about intimacy. It was really just about a guy's physical release.
Yeah. Interesting. Can you remember some of the other, like you said, there was about 4, but that was sort of the big one. What were the other ones that sort of tied into that?
Okay. So so here's the most destructive one is the idea that a wife is obligated to give her husband sex when he wants it. So we call that the obligation sex message.
Mhm.
And about 40% of women believed it at the point where they got married. And let me back up for a minute, okay? Because this is what it really comes down to. What is sex? Like, if we ask that question, people tend to hem and haw, and then you start describing something that sounds like IKEA furniture going together, right? Like slot A goes into tab B or whatever. Like, you're describing how body parts fit together. And if that is our definition of sex, then it's really about what a guy does. So she could be lying there making a grocery list in her head. She could be in emotional turmoil. She could even be in pain, and it would still count as sex. That's not what the Bible says.
Yeah.
The Bible does not, when the Bible is talking about God's design for sex, first of all, he calls it an intimate knowing in Genesis 4, verse 1. Right? So sex is supposed to be something really intimate. They use the same word in Genesis that David uses in the Psalms when he says, "Search me and know me, O God." Right? It's this deep desire for connection. So we know it's intimate. We know it's pleasurable for both. Just read Song of Songs. She says more things than he does. Okay? She's got more words. She's having a good time. And in 1 Corinthians 7, we know that it's totally mutual. So we get this picture of something which is intimate, mutual, and pleasurable for both.
Mhm.
But then we turn around and we tell women, you're obligated to give your husband sex when he wants it.
Mhm.
So we take this thing, which is supposed to be this deep knowing, and we turn it into an owing. We tell women, you owe him this. It doesn't matter what you're feeling. It doesn't matter what you're going through. If he wants it, you need to give it. And so what we're really telling women is, you don't matter. So this thing that is supposed to be a deep knowing, actually, no matter what you're feeling, it doesn't matter. You need to give it to him. So now instead of it being a knowing, it becomes an erasing of her as a person because her needs and emotions and wants don't matter at all compared to his great need. And to let you know how terrible this is, let me give you another stat. Vaginismus, which most people don't even know what that is. Okay.
Oh, I don't.
Okay. Vaginismus is a sexual pain disorder that women get where the walls, the vaginal walls contract and become really tight so that penetration becomes really difficult, if not impossible. It has been known for 50 years that evangelical women suffer from this at about 2 to 2.5 times the rate of the general population.
Oh my.
This
Dude,
is largely
really?
our problem. Yes. So in the general population, you're looking at an incidence rate of about 7%. We found an incidence rate of about 22%.
So why is that?
Okay. And here's the thing. The teaching that was the most correlated with this was the obligation sex message. When a woman gets married, feeling like she's obligated to give him sex, her chance of experiencing vaginismus increases to almost the same extent as if she had been abused.
Oh my goodness.
Because our
Really?
body interpret obligation as trauma.
Yeah.
Because both abuse and obligation say to a woman, you don't matter. He has the right to use you. And this is true whether or not he believes it. This is what we're trying to get people to understand from the Great Sex Rescue. The husband doesn't have to believe the obligation sex message for it to affect her body.
Yeah.
Because if this is what she grew up believing, then sex is something threatening to her.
Wow. I got to just let Kris, you better shoot a question out there because I just got to.
Yeah, you know what,
Man.
Sheila, I've read a lot of your stuff, but this one is new. I'm wondering, what are some of the other things that you noticed in your research? So you talked about obligation. You talked about, I forgot what that first one was, but you had 2 more. I think there were 4.
Yeah,
main
there's actually
messages.
3 more. So the idea that sex is
So
just for
there's
men is kind of like over them all.
Yeah.
And then there's the obligation sex.
Got
Another big one is all men struggle with lust. It's every man's battle.
That's right.
Yeah. So this is widely taught in the church.
I've heard it spoken from stage.
Yeah.
And I'm also a pastor and been doing this for 20 years. So I may have at some point in the past also said from stage. I got to just
That's
cover the
okay.
bases
You
here.
know what?
But
I did too. This is what we
Yeah.
all need to understand is like I taught a lot of crap too. All right.
yeah,
And you're
Absolutely.
allowed to grow. The big thing is, do we admit it when we find out that we were wrong? So
Yeah,
I don't
'cause-
want anyone to feel shame if they said
No.
something bad in the past. The big thing is, do you change when you figure out it was wrong?
thank God, Sheila, this is good. But the statement I've heard is The only men who don't struggle with lust are men who are dead.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Which is
Oh,
so.
Sheila,
So talk to us a bit about that one and your
Mhm.
findings there.
Yeah.
Okay, so we also, so first of all, let me tell you the effect on women, and then I'll tell you what our men's survey found. So when women are taught this, this is the one teaching where you don't even need to believe it. If you merely grow up in a culture where this is taught, and you're taught it as a teenager, even before you meet your future husband, your trust in your husband goes down and your libido goes down
Hmm.
No
in your
kidding.
future marriage. So teaching this to teen girls hurts her libido. And we also we've since done another survey of teen girls this time, or of women about their experiences as teens for our book She Deserves Better. And that is one of the big leading factors in vaginismus as well, is when teenagers are taught this, because then their bodies become threats and make them unsafe.
So literally, the cultures that we are creating in our evangelical churches, girls are growing up in many of these churches, and literally, it's impacting their physical bodies
That's right.
negatively and
That's
their
right.
sex life later on.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about the effect on boys, because this one really bothers me.
Yeah.
Okay. When we surveyed men, we were wanting to look at, is this lust message even true? You know, so we asked guys, hey, do you have a daily struggle with lust? And about 75% of men say, yes, I do. Okay. So already 25% don't. So it's not every man, but 75% do. 75% is a lot. Okay. I get it. We then gave men of about 4 or 5 different scenarios where they could possibly lust. And we gave them a bunch of different possibilities, like what would you do in this scenario? We asked men if they watched porn. We asked a bunch of other questions. And so when you look at that 75%, all right, half of them do not watch porn, and they would not lust in any situation that we gave them. And so it looks like what's happening is that men have been taught that noticing that a woman is beautiful means they've already lusted.
And then they feel guilty about it and
So
think
they
that
feel
they have
guilty.
a struggle with lust.
And so, you know, you teach this 13-year-old boy, he's got hormones, he's just starting to notice that girls have chests, you know, maybe he's 12, whatever. And he's taught that you need to be careful where your eyes go because you're going to lust. And so he feels like, if I see a girl's body, I am sinning. And he's in an impossible situation.
Yes.
Because everywhere he looks, he sees something which he finds attractive. And so he gets angry at the world, or he internalizes that and feels ashamed and feels like he's never going to measure up. God is always angry at him. And that shame can bear out in all kinds of different ways. He's more likely to get addicted to porn. If he does start using porn, it's going to be much harder for him to stop because of these messages. All kinds of stuff can happen to him. But if instead we just simply teach both boys and girls, because, by the way, girls are visual too. There is no actual scientific data that boys are more visual than girls are. They just interpret it differently.
What?
Yep.
Say
Yeah,
that again. Our listeners need to hear that a second time, please.
So there were 2 huge meta-analyses done of all the MRI scans and the neuroimaging scans studies that have been done that have looked at whether or not men are more visual than women. And in both 2019 and 2021, they found that there were no significant brain differences in terms of this stuff. It's so just that women, okay, this is going to get technical, but women have more arousal non-concordance. So they might be physically aroused, but it doesn't register to them mentally because they don't like what they see. So men are more in touch with their bodies, which makes sense. When a guy gets an erection, it's more obvious than for women. And then they tend to be aroused by different things, et cetera, but it's still visual. So it's not more. Okay. So if we have this little 12, 13, 14-year-old girl and boy, and we just say to them, it is totally normal to be attracted to someone that is attractive. It is completely normal to have those feelings, but it's really important that you treat one another with respect.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that you honor the dignity in other people.
Yeah.
And so no matter what, just treat people with respect. And if we teach them things like that, rather than you are sinning if you find someone attractive, then we won't cause the kind of shame we do. Because what did Jesus actually say? All right. He said, whoever looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery. So looking is a deliberate action with lust, with a deliberate mindset. So he didn't say whoever sees a beautiful woman He didn't say whoever notices a woman's chest. Like, he didn't say any of those things. He said whoever looks deliberately with lust. So whoever looks in order to obtain sexual gratification, in order to focus on someone, in order to dehumanize or depersonalize someone, that is lust. But just noticing someone is attractive is not lust.
Yeah. That is okay.
Wow,
So
that should take a load of shame off a whole bunch of guys right there.
Oh, 100%. And you know what, Sheila, when I first came across some of your material, one of the things that I noticed, speaking of notice, is that your phrase, you said, lusting if not noticing, and you had that in big bold letters. And I remember thinking to myself, I wish I heard that when I was in my early 20s and my late teens. You know, I grew up in the Promise Keepers ministries, and I went to weekend after weekend after weekend about fighting purity, about, you know, you got to bounce your eyes. I would love to hear you talk about that. But, you know, when you talked about earlier about obligation sex creating this trauma effect, like a physical effect on women, would you say that this what you're talking about as lusting or making guys believe that just by noticing you're lusting is having a similar traumatic effect on their bodies?
I don't know if it does in their bodies, but it certainly does. It certainly manifests itself in compulsive behaviors, in self-soothing, and certainly in their relationship with God. Because imagine feeling like the way that God made your body put you in this situation where you can't help but sin all day long.
Yeah.
Like, that is an impossible situation to be in.
Yeah.
And so there is so much shame that goes along with that. And then you're taught, okay, but it's okay because once you get married, you're going to have a sexual outlet. Like, once you get married, this is going to be okay for you. And our books even teach that, right? Like the Every Man's Battle book series sold 4 million copies. It told guys that that women can be your methadone. It literally called your wife the methadone for your sex addiction.
I never read those books, but obviously I know many people that did, but it actually, what?
Yeah, it said, and I quote, when it was talking to women at the end of a chapter, when he quits cold turkey, be like a merciful vial of methadone for him.
Yeah.
And then it said to men, your wife can be like methadone when you feel your temperature rising.
Oh man. Wow.
And what is methadone? Let's just think this through, okay? Yeah. Methadone is a drug that they give to people who are addicted to heroin or a similar opioid, right?
Yeah.
In order to make you not go after the opioid that you really want. So what methadone is it soothes you and numbs you enough that you don't go for what you really want. So by calling women methadone, you're saying your wife can soothe you and numb you enough so you don't go after the women you really want.
Yeah.
That's a horrible message.
And so what does that then tell the wife, the woman? What is that? What is the underlying communicative message there?
Yeah, it says that you are his masturbatory aid.
Exactly.
You are there to make sure that he doesn't sin. You are a sin management tool. God created you as a sin management tool for your husband.
Not to mention, she now becomes the reason when he does struggle, if she's not giving him enough sex, and I've seen this over and over again over the years in church, is guys blame their wife. Well, we don't have sex that often, so what am I going to do? And it's like, well, you're not an animal.
Right.
Exactly.
But also guys remember that if a guy feels like he's sinning every time he notices a woman is beautiful, he can be turning to his wife because she's the only legitimate sexual outlet he has, he thinks, right? So he thinks that by pressuring her to have sex, he's actually doing something righteous because he's trying so desperately not to sin against her. He's trying not to sin against God. And the only way to do that is to use his wife's body. And so he thinks that by pressuring her, that by, pestering her, that by turning to her, that he's actually serving her.
Yeah.
And so when she turns him away, he'll feel even more rejected. I mean, it's just a really hot mess. And it looks nothing like Jesus.
That is, yikes.
Chris, go ahead.
Well, the first question that just pops in my mind, I have some others here too, but just while we're here, what do you do with couples now who are, or what would you say to women now, they've been married 10, 15, 20 years? And for tons of evangelical women and men, this is the reality of what they've been raised and what they've been taught.
Yeah.
So now what? What do we, or I guess this is what we're talking about here, but what do we say to them?
Yeah, I think what I would say is this: things aren't going to get better if you keep going on the road you're on. And so if you want to change, you got to change, and it's going to be hard.
Yeah.
And it's going to mean a lot of reevaluating, but it's the only way to get back to what God really wanted for you. And women matter. And that's something that we just weren't taught. You know, another big finding that we had in our survey is our 47-point orgasm gap. Okay. By which I mean that 95% of men almost always reach orgasm in a given sexual encounter. And the equivalent number for women is only 48.
Is this among like Christian couples or is this just general? This is
among
Christian
evangelicals, which looks like we have a higher gap than other couples. Yeah.
Which in the meantime, I've heard it said often from stage in churches that Christians have better sex lives than non-Christians. Is that not true?
If you look at committed couples, no, it isn't. And the biggest difference is the belief that women actually are supposed to reach orgasm, because women in the church have not been taught that and men haven't been taught that.
So if we compare committed Christian couples, married couples, to committed non-Christian couples, and we compare those two groups of people, their sex life, Christians actually come out.
It depends how you measure it, okay? Because here's a problem. First of all, Christians have higher pain rates and we have lower orgasm rates, but we have higher satisfaction rates. So if you ask women, how happy are you by your orgasm frequency? Okay. Even women who never orgasm will say that they're satisfied if their primary belief is that their purpose in marriage is to serve and submit to their husband.
Oh, so that's why we get a certain satisfaction percentage, but it's not.
Yeah, it's not because they're enjoying themselves. It's because they think that I am doing a good job because I'm pleasing my husband.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Whereas a non-Christian woman wouldn't say that's satisfying.
That's right. Yeah.
So, Sheila, how much of this is being
Is this just an audio podcast? Because I wish y'all could see like Sturgeon right now.
It is a video and audio.
Yeah, we do both. Oh, jeepers! It's like this is. I mean, the crazy thing is, it's just so. This is so ingrained as this is the way. This is what righteousness looks like. Like it's not even questioned.
Yeah.
In a lot of places. I mean, it is being questioned. I mean, you're writing these books and you're doing these things and we have you here and stuff, but it's generally not questioned how we've taught these things.
Yeah.
So, Sheila, how much of this is coming from purity culture? So maybe
we should define that. We should define that.
Yeah, define purity culture.
Okay, so purity culture was a widespread movement that I would date kind of from like the mid 90s, and it went maybe to roughly 2000. And while Christians have always said that you should wait for marriage for sex, purity culture added more to it because it said that your primary identity was your virginity. It really stressed maintaining virginity as the main sign of your walk with God. And it put a lot of outsized pressure on girls as opposed to boys. So girls were made responsible for boys not lusting by what they dressed, how they dressed. Modesty rules really came in. Modest is hottest. All of that stuff was not stuff I grew up in youth group. You know, in my youth group in downtown Toronto in the 80s, I was going to a church that was right next door to the first Morgentaler clinic in the country. And, you know, what we talked about was, we talked a lot about abortion. We brought coffee out for the police who were always guarding the clinic. We got to know them. We prayed through the 1040 window with evangelism. Like we were so focused on missions. We lived in the most multicultural city in the world. And so our youth group was all about prayer and missions and telling your testimony. And somehow over the 20 years after that, everything changed and it entirely became purity. And I had no idea of this when my girls were going through it. I just assumed they were going through what I went through in youth group, but it was totally different.
Okay.
And there was really this outsized influence on not dating, on courtship. You know, dating is bad. And so millennials weren't supposed to date. Yeah, they weren't supposed to kiss till the wedding. Like, and all of that really came in early aughts. And then, just has gone away recently. And so was purity culture responsible for what was being taught to married people? I actually don't think so, because when we looked at marriage books, like Active Marriage, for instance, by Tim LaHaye,
which everybody used to get. That's what we got for our premarital counseling here.
Me too. Totally wrecked me. I actually blame that book for my own case of vaginismus. But anyway, if you look at Active Marriage, if you look at Intended for Pleasure, they were all written before purity culture, and they had all of these messages. So I actually think that purity culture was more of an outgrowth of what was being said in the marriage books than it was that the marriage books changed with purity culture.
And what about, like, there was always a bit of a promise attached to it as well. Kind of like, the prosperity gospel. You get these preachers, if you tithe, you're going to be blessed.
Yes.
I remember growing up in the I was growing up in the 90s, and like the huge purity message. And then the idea was save it for marriage, and then, wow,
it'll be awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to downplay, like sex can be really good, and there's a lot of Christian couples experiencing great sex. It's just that it's not all of them. Yeah. And what we found is that the people who aren't experiencing great sex, when you really dig down deep, it's often because they've internalized negative messages. Right. And so if we can get rid of the negative messages, I think we can really save people from a lot of heartache.
Yeah. And one of those messages, those negative messages, is the fact that, if you don't, save yourself from marriage, you become damaged goods, right? Yeah. And now you're no longer a virgin, you're damaged.
Right. And you think about a couple, I had a couple on my blog, I was talking with them over the last few days, so they had sex before they were married 22 years ago or something like that. So height of purity culture, right? They have sex before they're married, they get married, and the marriage isn't going great, And so what they assume is that God is punishing them.
That's right.
And so, the idea is all of this is happening to us because we had sex before we're married. As opposed to, hey, we're just having normal communication issues that all couples have, and this is actually quite fixable. Yeah. It was seen as God is punishing me, and it just snowballed into, issue after issue they never really dealt with because they assumed this is just the price that we're paying for our sin.
So I actually know. No, go ahead, Chris. I just to insert this one. I actually personally know, or knew. I'll say knew because it's from a while ago. But there was a period of time here in Steinbach, and I knew pastors who they were meeting with couples, and they would tell me, whenever there's a problem in the marriage, the first question I ask is, did you have premarital sex?
Yeah.
The answer is usually yes. And we get them confessing that and breaking soul ties.
Yeah.
And that was this is the big thing. The premarital sex is what did it.
Yeah.
Which brings this whole oh man, is this like a demonic stronghold now? Is this makes it a huge.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask. So I love the message that you bring to this. And I'm wondering, do you ever get pushback, people saying you're going soft on sin?
Mm-hmm. First of all, I don't think we are.
No,
I'm not sure what sin I'm going soft on. But I think the big pushback I get is that I'm being mean to men. Whereas I don't see why it's mean to men to say that I believe men have the Holy Spirit just as much as women do. Yeah. And I believe that men can be emotionally healthy. And I believe that men can be sexually healthy. And I believe that men can be kind and respectful and generous. And I don't think that's a negative message.
No, not totally.
But what I do is I say, hey, look, one of the biggest problems with the way that we handle sex in the church is that we define the problem in general as women don't want sex enough. So if a couple comes in for counseling and there's a sex problem, it usually boils down to, well, what can we do to make her want sex more? Mm-hmm. What can we do to make her have sex more? Because her not having sex enough is the problem. And what I'm saying is, no, it's not. Because in our survey, I'm going to list 5 things for you, okay? So everyone get ready.
Let's go.
If she frequently reaches orgasm, if they have high marital satisfaction, if there's no sexual dysfunction, if they feel emotionally close during sex, and if there's no porn use, frequency takes care of itself.
Okay, well, you better give our listeners that one more time. Guys, get your pens out now, and women.
So, okay, I will. I'll say it again, all right? If she frequently reaches orgasm, if there's no porn use in the marriage, if there's no sexual dysfunction in the marriage, if they feel emotionally close during sex, and if there's high marital satisfaction, then frequency isn't a problem. So if she has no libido, instead of saying, hey, you need to prioritize this more and have more sex, we need to ask, why doesn't she want sex? The church always says, look, God made sex to be amazing.
Yeah.
This is an amazing thing. Those two things can't both be true. God can't make sex to be amazing, and also women never want it.
And so and you have to do it.
If sex is amazing, women should want it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so if women aren't wanting it, let's start treating that with curiosity rather than blame. And let's start saying, what are the dynamics that are going on here? And they're not always about the husband. Please hear me on this one. This is one of the big things we found in Great Sex Rescue and why we did this. So much of the reason that women may not feel emotionally close during sex is because of all this garbage that she grew up believing that has put up a real roadblock in her mind and heart towards sex and towards her body. Okay. Yeah. A lot of the sexual dysfunction isn't necessarily caused by her husband. It's caused by this stuff that she's internalized. So some of the marital satisfaction problems can be caused by some of the stuff she's internalized, or she could just simply be a victim of sexual trauma in her past. And that can really impact how she sees sex. So I'm not saying it's always a marriage problem, but what I am saying is unless you deal with the root issues, we're not looking at the right problem. Because libido isn't a problem, it's a symptom.
Oh, that's so good.
But if it makes you feel better, this is the one big thing I changed my teaching on too when I looked at our survey data. So I think we all did this. This was really common. So again, the problem is not necessarily what you taught in the past, although we all need to apologize to people if we can. But it really is like, are we going to change with new data? Because the Christian world there's been a lot of harm done by our resources, and we didn't have a lot of other resources. So it's natural that we believe this stuff, right? But we can move on now, and we can get healthy.
And what you're saying here is actually, like, you're not saying the Bible's wrong. What I hear you saying is you're saying actually what the Bible is saying is very different than what we've been saying.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, think about 1 Corinthians 7, okay? And these are often very weaponized verses against women, but I actually think they're saying the opposite of what people think. So, 1 Corinthians 7, 3-5, it says, the husband must fulfill his marital duties to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. And the wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to the husband. And the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to the wife. And do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan won't tempt you for your lack of self-control. And people can say, see, you're not supposed to deprive each other, right? Yeah. So therefore she's got to have more sex. A couple of problems with that. Sex is something mutual, intimate, pleasurable for both. It is not one-sided intercourse. If you are telling her she has to submit to one-sided intercourse where she feels used, where she's in pain, where she doesn't feel intimate, she is already being deprived, and those verses don't even apply. Yeah. She's the one being deprived.
Yeah, good point.
But the second thing is there's complete and utter mutuality there. It's the wife's needs that are mentioned first. Yeah. And then it says, okay, yeah, the wife doesn't have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Yeah. But likewise, the husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but the wife does. In Roman times, when he wrote that, husbands owned their wives' bodies to the extent that they could kill them if they wanted to. So everyone listening to that, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. And the audience is going, yeah, whatever. And then Paul says, but likewise the husband. And everyone's what? That's the revolutionary part. And
that is radical feminism right there in the New Testament.
Yeah. And yet every man's battle, when they talk about those verses, they say that men are promised sexual release in 1 Corinthians 7, just as women are promised honor and esteem in 1 Peter 3.
Oh, my goodness.
Which is the stupidest thing I've ever heard, because first of all, men are not promised regular sexual release, because that is not the definition of sex. But second of all, even if you do say that men are promised that, you have to be intellectually honest and say that women are promised it too.
Right.
But they don't even think that those verses apply to women, even though they obviously do.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
that
I-
is the Bible.
I don't have a problem with the Bible. I have a
Mhm.
problem with our evangelical resources,
Yeah.
which have so missed the boat on this.
Yeah. No, I've preached on that verse before, and it's like it's just on a surface level, it's so loaded with mutuality, and yet we sometimes don't focus on the one side of it. Okay, so I'm curious, and now I'm sure a lot of our listeners listening to the conversation are thinking, okay, so how do I raise my child? I have a 10-year-old
Good question.
son. A lot of the messaging coming from the church is you kind of prepare them for the talk, the big sex talk. How do you suggest maybe a better, more healthier way to not just talk to the boy, but boy and girl as a child? I'm curious what.
Yeah, so we do have another book for that. So Great Sex
perfect.
Rescue was our big one on for women, and then we just wrote She Deserves Better for moms of daughters or youth group leaders with girls. And we don't have one for boys yet. Maybe we'll write one for boys. We keep having people ask us to, but I'm not a boy, so I just feel like, I don't know, but we'll see. But I'll tell you a few of the big things. One of them is that information is always good. There are no downsides to more information. And I think often we're scared of telling kids stuff because we think as soon as they know about something, they're going to do it. The opposite is actually true. And, what we found for girls is that the more they knew things and the younger they knew things, if they knew it well, they were far less likely to be involved in risky behaviors. They had higher self-esteem. They were far less likely to marry abusers, which was a huge thing for us.
Interesting.
And yet when you look at millennials and I'm a Gen X, and when we looked at the survey results for millennials, Gen X, and boomer women, and Gen Z as well, there was such a huge drop off in sex ed for millennials. Like Gen X and boomer women had better sex ed in the evangelical church than millennials did.
Really?
Because purity culture came in, and so in a lot of schools, not so much in Canada probably, but in the U.S., and most of our survey respondents were Americans, so this may not apply so much for those of us north of the border, but
sure.
A lot of schools brought in abstinence only education. A lot of people pulled their kids out of public schools, were homeschooling them where and they didn't give them adequate sex education. I homeschooled my kids all the way through. So I'm not anti-homeschooling. Okay. My kids are going to homeschool their kids, but we do have a responsibility to give our kids proper information. And millennials had far less sex ed. They did not have as good understanding of consent as Gen X women did. So the more that we can give our kids information, the better they are overall.
So you're saying that abstinence only teaching on sex actually isn't enough. We actually need to teach our kids from a young age about the act of sex itself and consent. You even mentioned consent there. Yeah.
Age appropriate, but yeah. And they need to know things like, which we don't like talking about. They need to know what oral sex is. They need to know like all of these things. It is such a huge protective factor against abuse.
Okay. Do you have more to say on that?
Okay. So
that's fascinating.
In one of our focus groups, a woman was saying, so she was 13 years old and abused by a youth pastor. And it wasn't at never to the level of intercourse, but, there was heavy petting, there was oral sex, manual stimulation, etc. And because she knew about intercourse, but that's all she knew about. And so she thought that what they were doing was something that only they had ever done. She didn't have words for it.
Oh, interesting.
She didn't know that this is something that people often, can coerce people into doing. She didn't know that this was necessarily, she just felt terrible about it, couldn't understand why, couldn't put words to it, so couldn't tell anyone about it. And this went on for a few years.
Okay, that's interesting because, one of the things I sometimes hear from evangelicals whose kids are in the public school system is they're really terrified of any sort of teaching about sex, like whether it be consent, different kinds of sex, oral sex, anal sex, vaginal sex.
Yeah.
Because they're afraid that this is like, sometimes the words you hear nowadays, it's really become like amped up and it's like they're grooming our kids kind of thing. What would you say to that?
I think there's definitely ways that it could be done badly. And I'm not saying that I support everything that they do everywhere, but I think having kids aware of what sex is, what body parts are, what arousal is like, what the sexual response cycle is like. It makes them not feel like they're crazy. It empowers them. And the more kids know, the less likely they are to be involved in risky behaviors.
Yeah.
Within the church is that we've got this all or nothing approach. And, and because we're focusing on virginity, which is virginity is not the goal. Chastity is
No.
the goal. Virginity is not the goal. Virginity is something, it's not even a real thing. Well, I mean, it's just stupid. But I hate it because, someone can be raped. Okay. So if we're saying that it's virginity that makes you a Christian and someone can take that away from you, what kind of a message is that?
Yeah.
Good point.
Okay. And chastity is not a state. Chastity is a practice. So somebody can have had a lot of sexual partners in the past. They may have used porn in the past, but right now they are walking in chastity, which is just simply putting your sex life under the lordship of Christ.
Yeah.
Chastity does not mean that I am not having sex. Chastity just means that my sex life is under the lordship of Christ. And so if I'm married, I'm celebrating that with my spouse. If I'm not married, I'm showing restraint and I'm treating other people with honor and dignity. But that's what it means.
That is such a good... whereas virginity is something once you've lost it, it's lost.
And this
or
is
like you
the
said, if it's
problem,
taken.
is that the more religious a person is, and they grew up with that message, then you're date raped at 15, or you go further than you wanted to, and now I have no reason to say no. And we heard this from so many girls in our or women now, but talking about their girlhood. And they said, I had sex, and so I didn't feel like I had a reason that I could say no anymore.
So why not?
Yeah, and they didn't even necessarily want to. They just felt like he's pressuring me and I don't have a good reason anymore. Because my reason before was I need to save this for marriage. Now that that horse has left the barn, then I no longer have a reason. Whereas girls who weren't taught that could say, yeah, I had sex with him, but I decided I don't want to have sex anymore. Yep. And that was enough of a reason for them.
Yeah. Which is immensely healthy.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That all or nothing is so damaging.
Yeah, and it's a little bit like I grew up kind of when Harry Potter were coming out. Total change of topic, but related. I remember thinking that my friends who are watching this, they're going to go into witchcraft now because they watch Harry Potter. And I'm like, I am not staying far away from Harry Potter.
Oh yeah, I didn't let my kids read it, and then until they got to be 13, and then I was like, "Oh, this is silly. Let's just read it." And my daughter loved it. She thinks she loved it more because she waited till she was 13, so now she's trying to figure out how to make her kids wait till 13. But yeah,
she saved herself for 13.
Yeah.
And this podcast just became extremely unpopular. Just one little.
So we talked. So this has been an awesome conversation. So we talked a bit about the damaging effects of some of this messaging on men, women. I'm curious, what has been the damaging effects that you've seen on people who are single?
Oh, good question.
Yeah, one of the big things that we do in the church is that we teach that marriage is the end all and be all, and we are really raising young people to be married. And that is the Christian goal, to be married and have kids. That is not the biblical goal. I mean, just read 1 Corinthians 7, right? And Paul was stressing singleness so that you could devote yourself to Christ. And yet in the church, we really don't have a place for singles. And I think we would be so much better off as a church if our goal stopped being marriage and started being emotional wholeness and spiritual wholeness and health. And if we raised people to understand emotional health and spiritual growth and things like that, then people who were whole would make better marriage partners anyway. But if you didn't get married, it would be all right.
Exactly.
But a lot of our talk around marriage has really alienated those who are single and made them feel like they're less than or not Christian. Because then what do we turn around and say to single people? Oh, well, God will bring the right person once you are totally committed to Jesus. And, you need to totally sell out to Jesus first, as if every married person has been totally sold out to Jesus.
You just need to sit with a couple of couples and
yeah. So I think we've done a big disservice there. I think we've done a big disservice with the way that we haven't taught people about self-control and consent. So we've taught people, especially men, that your ability to live for Christ is really dependent on what the women around you do. So you're
Mhm.
quite helpless,
Right.
as opposed to saying, hey, you know what? There's going to be pretty women everywhere, but you can still treat them with respect and it's not a big deal,
Yeah.
and
That is
And-
just such a hopeful message, I think,
mhm.
Absolutely.
and helpful.
And so teaching people that they are completely at the mercy of what women choose to wear is really not helpful.
Yeah.
Well, I've
And-
talked to guys who already started the battle, because this is this whole
Yeah.
every man's battle culture. Everything's seen as a battle, which is exhausting. When your whole life is a battle,
Well,
that's
it's terribly
exhausting.
Mhm.
But they would talk about, one of the malls in Winnipeg for years had a Victoria's Secret
Mhm.
outlet in the mall, and of course, these pictures
Yeah.
of women in scanty clothing. And these guys would tell me, yeah, like as soon as I drive into the parking lot, I can just feel the weight, and I'm
Mm.
starting to fight already. And I was always like, man, that doesn't sound super healthy, but I guess, yeah, I mean, you got to fight the lust. Whereas I always just treated it as more, I wasn't even thinking of it, and then I would just
Yeah.
kind of walk by and like, even there, you don't even almost know what to do with it. It's like,
Yeah.
but
Yep.
yeah, if you're at that mercy, it's just out of your control. Even to live righteously is just completely out of your control.
Mhm. And then our approach to porn use too has been very negative. I mean, this could be a whole other podcast series, but what we've told people is you just need to quit. You need to white knuckle it. You need to try harder. And we really haven't gotten to the root of a lot of it, which is a lot of shame, a lot of the fact that you're 12, 13 years old, you see it for the first time, you start seeking it out. When you use porn, it soothes you, and so you start turning to porn when you're bored, when you feel rejected, when you're anxious, and so it becomes this soothing mechanism. And a lot of people, both boys and girls, but primarily boys because they just tend to use porn more, have never actually learned how to handle difficult emotions. And so they put it on porn, or when they get married, they put it on their spouse. And I think that's a huge problem with our single people too, is we just haven't taught emotional regulation. We haven't, it's not, you can't just quit. I mean, you can, but it is very difficult to quit when that is the way you handle your anxiety.
It's almost like smoking. Smoking, for many people who struggle to quit
Mhm.
smoking, it's not just the nicotine.
Yeah.
It's the whole habit. Like I've talked to many people who've tried smoking or who have quit smoking, and they're like, you know what I miss so much? Just stepping out
Yeah.
for 5 minutes and just taking a breath. And it's like, well, that part is healthy.
Yeah. And so, how can we talk in different ways about emotional regulation? Because instead we turn everything into a sin issue. And I'm not saying it's not, I'm just saying it's more than that. And I think if we're going to be helpful to people, we need to really talk about the complete picture.
Brilliant.
So maybe just to bring this conversation to a close, what are maybe 2 pieces of advice that you can leave our listeners with on what you view as a healthy view of marriage, as well as a holistic view of sexual purity?
Oh gosh. Okay. I think what I would just say is that, sex is meant to be passionate and fun.
Mhm.
All right. And that doesn't mean that every time has to be like, swinging from the chandeliers, but just this should not be the most stressful part of your life. And for so many of us, it's become so super serious because we take this so seriously, and it's got all these layers on it. And I just want to tell people, like, you can start deconstructing those layers and get back to, to what is just a celebration of how we feel about each other. Sex is supposed to be the expression of your relationship. It's not the thing that holds your relationship together. It's the expression of it. And, and so let's put it in its proper place. Let's enjoy it, but let's put it in its proper place.
Yes.
And the other thing I would
That's
say is,
good.
like, sex can't fix stuff. Okay. It isn't going to fix insecurity in you. It isn't going to make you feel connected if you're not doing the work of connection outside the bedroom. It isn't going to fix lust. And let's stop putting too much weight on sex, because often the reason that it breaks down is because we're putting things on it that it wasn't supposed to have.
Mhm.
That was gold. This whole conversation was gold. Sheila, thanks for taking time to talk to us. Everybody from our church and who's listening to this podcast has benefited from this time together. Thanks again.
Awesome. Yes.
Thank you
Well,
so
hello,
much.
Steinbeck. Yes, my grandpa ran a choir in Steinbeck in like the 1950s and 60s. So,
Oh, so cool. So you have roots here. That's awesome.
yeah.
Okay, see you later.